And I've been doing this off and on for years, but in updating it, I'm happy to tell you. And I do have pictures of people periodically, but the stars are the buildings, and which is not to say that the school is a place of great masterpieces. There are some good buildings, and I think one very important building. Above all, I just think it's an interesting story. And I'm going to cover the ground fairly quickly. And some of you have probably seen this before, but I'm banking on the fact that you won't remember a thing. So here we go. Okay, now I get a kick out of saying that the history of the North Shore Country Day School begins in the primordial ooze of ancient Kenilworth. And that's over the top, I admit, but this is Kenilworth Avenue in the 1890s. Look at those little saplings. It really does look pretty raw, doesn't it? And around this time, the village invited Mr. Francis King Cook from Chicago to start a school for boys, which he called the Rugby School for Boys. And we think, it's now a little unclear, we think this is the one of the buildings that he used, now a house, on Leicester Road. And it was just a few days ago that it occurred to me, wait a second, Leicester Road. I wonder if that has anything to do with the Leicester Hall at school, which it might. We don't know. But at any rate, this is the first, this is Cook's school. Rugby. Well, within 10 years, in 1900 or so, Kenilworth was starting its own public school, and Mr. Cook pulled up stake and moved a mile or a mile and a half to the north to start another school. And this was, he called the Gerton School for Girls. We have the Rugby School for Boys, and now he has the Gerton School for Girls, and he purchases this property at the highest point in Winnetka. The old Garland Estates in 1874. Look at that baby. A wonderful Victorian Italianate towered building, and this was the main building. But a little bit to the west was the coach house of the Garland Estate, and that's how the Gerton School began. Now, it lasted about 16 or 17 years, and for a period of time it was quite prosperous, and they ended up building 3 more buildings, which you're going to see pictures of. And so there was a real campus. I mean, it wasn't just an old house and the coach house. There was a campus that occupied this site. Unfortunately, the school fell on hard times in the middle of the teens or so, and by 1918, a group of parents in Winnetka got together to form this new progressive school, the North Shore Country Day School for Girls and Boys, K through 12, and this was the first campus. They leased the property from Mr. Cook to see how things would go, and so the school had this sort of instant campus. And I had to, yeah, and of course they hired the young, dynamic Perry Dunlop Smith to be the head and to lead this new enterprise. Now this isn't, you can't see this very well, but I'm going to zero in on a few of these buildings. This, I believe, is the oldest picture of the campus of the North Shore Country Day School. Now Sierra points out that the Historical Society has yearbooks from the Gerton School, which I've never seen. This I took from, I believe, the first yearbook, which would have been, I guess, 1920, and it's not a true panoramic picture. There are a series put together, but this is the campus of the school, the new school, from another building that was part of the campus, which I'll get to in a moment. But on the far left, we're moving from east to west or left to right. No, we're not. We're starting with the building from which this picture was taken, which is Leicester Hall. Leicester Hall got a new site at the southeastern corner of the campus some years later, but it was originally where the tennis courts are today. Probably built 1912, 1913, we don't know for sure. So a Tudor-style building, and I think we have a picture of the new, there's the painted, the new look for Leicester. So anyway, that photograph is being taken, or those photographs, from Leicester Hall in its original position. So there is the Garland Estate, or which came to be called Knowsley. Now I'm not going to dwell on this, but if you are sharp, you'll notice that the tower is lower than it was in that earlier picture, and it's lost its porch. They already began to monkey around with the building during the Gerton period. So this is how it looked at the beginning of North Shore. Next up, is a building that was built again in the teens. Now we're talking about the whole campus. This is the gymnasium, very simple barrel arched building, which is roughly behind the auditorium. Was behind the auditorium today. Next up, in the back a little bit, was a building that was called Elliott Hall. And probably again 1914, 1912, vaguely prairie style, the modern style of the period, which housed the middle school for a long time at North Shore. But again, these are the very first buildings, so this is 1920 or so. And then the coach house at the west end of the campus, and then what's the... Oh yeah, right. Sorry. Yeah, that was the campus for a couple of years while the school was an experiment. But within a short period of time, it was clear that the school was going to be a success, and it was going to last. And so and these buildings, this hodgepodge of buildings, were not adequate. So Smith and the board got together and began to talk about a grand plan. And this is the early 20s, which was a very important time in Chicago's history, hence this slide. The implementation of the Burnham Plan was going on, the building of Grant Park, and also North Michigan Avenue. Let's see, North Michigan Avenue was taking shape. This is a few years later. So it was a very exciting time for Chicago. And there was a lot of money, in the economy. Times were booming. Winnetka began to think big, and North Shore Country Day School was thinking big as well. So there's a connection, by the way. Winnetka had its own plan of 1917. And a key building in this plan was a new village hall. And it so happens that the architect of this new village hall was also the architect of the new buildings, the soon-to-be new buildings at the North Shore Country Day School, Edwin Clark, who also, by the way, designed the Indian Hill Club that you're in right now, the first building. So Clark is and he's a school parent, one of the founders of the school, so it was logical to turn to him. And he came up with a scheme for a new series of buildings in this early 20s period, which was the scene of so much excitement in Chicago and in the area, as I said, in Winnetka. And here is the scheme. I hope you can see this reason. It's a nice drawing of a series of buildings that form a sort of a wall facing an open space, a green, a garden, a large park-like space. They're Georgian, traditional, handsomely done, and it was this scheme that would be the master plan for the school for quite a few years. Things didn't turn out exactly the way this picture indicates, but it was pretty close. Oh yeah, what he was thinking of, among other things, was the sort of New England green idea of Georgian buildings facing such a space. And here is that idea come to life at Western Reserve Academy in Hudson, Ohio, which you may have seen, I don't know. But in any case, when I saw this years ago, it struck me as a little bit similar. Okay, here we go. So what happens? First of all, here now this is 22 to 27 roughly. 1922, the new high school building, Dunlop Hall goes up, which I've always compared to a sort of a New England meeting house. And notice the shutters on the windows, which would disappear later. So it had a charm to it that it would lose a little bit later. And then the second building in the group, 1924, was a little behind the wall facing that park, which looks like a little bit like a congregational church with that steeply pitched roof and the cupola and the pediment and the big arched windows to house a gymnasium. And then the final building in this series is the grandest of the buildings on the campus, and the one that is the most prominent, particularly on its position facing that green, the auditorium building, with again the cupola, the pediment, and a series of columns. So a little fancier than the one you just saw, than the old gym. The columns were a little fatter than the ones in the original drawing, and it doesn't have quite the refinement and the elegance, but it's still a very handsome building, I think. So there you have it. We're now in there you almost have it. A couple other projects occurred. Oh yeah, this just shows you the new auditorium on the right in relation to Knowsley Hall. Don't forget Knowsley, it's still there. The Garland House is still there up at the top of its hill. A little bit out of place amidst this Georgian village, this Victorian Grand Dame. A couple other projects in this amazing period of the 20s. The Diller Street used to go through the campus, was closed, or was I should say, it was cut off about a third of the way along. The school traded a piece of land, which is now a small park on Church Street between Church and Green Bay Road. In exchange, they were able to close off the streets, which made the campus safer. And at the same time, roughly, I think they acquired the farmhouse at the far northwestern corner. And now you could have playing fields, and they'd be safe, as I said. So it really was becoming a true campus in a grander sense. And finally, the moving, remember Lester, the oldest, still today, the oldest building on campus. Lester got moved from its position where the tennis courts are near Diller Street to its current position. And this is my little joke slide I used to, before people could zero in on it, I'd say, Perry Dunlap Smith, to save money, had the kids drag the building across the campus. He's really supervising a tug of war, which you can obviously see. Okay, so this is the late 20s when all this happens, and the Depression hits. It's not an easy time for the school and for a lot of the parents, but the school survives and even prospers to an extent during this period, to the point at least where in the late 30s, Perry Smith decides that it's time to get rid of that old coach house, remember, and build a new building which would be for the lower school. Mr. Clark said, wonderful. Do you remember my plan? And here I think is the plan. Yeah, there it is. There's the new building you're talking about. Smith apparently said, no, I don't want a traditional building. I want a new building. We live in a new era of new architecture. My friend Carlton Washburn is doing a new kind of building a mile or so away, the Crow Island School. I want something else. I don't exactly know what he said, but that was the gist of it. Clark, and what did he have in mind? He had in mind the architecture made popular, or people made aware of at the 1933 World's Fair. This is one of the houses of tomorrow at the fair. And he was also talking about the flat roof, and so he was also talking about Crow Island School, which is probably the first modern school design, I think, is really in the United States, and tremendously influential. So he had seen the drawings for Crow Island. He had been to the fair. He wanted something new. Clark, I don't think it would be too much to say he was brokenhearted, but he was annoyed. And so he turns the project, it still is firm, he turns the project over to a bunch of young Turk architects in his firm, including Franny Stanton, class of 1927, who had graduated from Yale a few years before and was working for Clark. And they're the ones who came up with this snazzy new modern design, which Clark had no patience with, apparently. And oh yeah, this is one of my favorite pictures from one of the yearbooks, showing an hourglass with the old coach house up on top, and those two figures are Perry Smith and Mr. Clark, and then it's disappearing, and down below, voila, the new modern flat top, blocky kind of building. And Sierra found this wonderful picture, I don't know if you can see it too well, in which it talks about the newfangled ventilating system called air conditioning, and the glass blocks that you could kick and it wouldn't break the glass. And in other words, this was a really up-to-date, avant-garde building in every respect. And here it is. And it really hasn't changed that much. The windows have changed, but flat top, blocky, and as I like to say, racing stripes, those dark horizontal stripes running across the facade. No traditional detailing whatsoever, or very, very little. This is about it. Do you see those columns, those fluted columns, that is, those grooved columns that are that are shrunk from those big fat columns in front of the auditorium? That's about it in terms of traditional, and it really isn't very traditional. And Smith leading or making some sort of comment or supervising some sort of event at the opening of the school or close to it. Here's how it looks today. So the windows have changed, but it's still fundamentally the same high-ceilinged, light-filled, still kind of modern design. And the lighting fixtures have changed, but light still pours in through those windows. And it's important to realize that Smith wanted the faculty involved in the design of the building. They're the ones who insisted on light and as much light as possible. But my favorite, and other things too, my favorite example is that Smith designed the desks for the kids. And there was one little drawer that the teacher couldn't open so the kids could put their little, secrets in. I don't think that would work today, but anyway. And finally, the desks were manufactured by the prisoners at Stateville near Joliet. Isn't that wonderful? So I don't know, those desks, or one of them should be saved. I don't know if many still exist, probably not. But the interior has been redone, but it still, as I said, it still has that I think, 1930s modern kind of feel to it. So here's the campus, 1939 or so. Showing this mixture of periods, the Knowsley on the left, and then Leicester. I'm not sure Leicester's in the picture, but is still there. Elliott's still there, and then you have the new lower school on the right. So it's an interesting mix of buildings. Another 15 years would go by before the next building. This tends to be the case. 15 or 20-year intervals mark the major building periods. And this would be a pretty important period in terms of history. 2 wars and the onset of the baby boom, and also important history in the school itself with the retirement of Perry Smith in 1954 and Nat French taking over at that time. And here's a picture of Nat French with the students looking over blueprints so you know what's coming. The next major building period in the history of North Shore is really already commenced, but most of it would occur under French. And here is the first project, which began while Perry Smith was in his last year, and it was named after him, the middle school building. And if this were a test, I would ask you to look at these 2 pictures and tell me which direction is this building going in. Remember, 15 years has elapsed since the lower school. Which direction is it going in terms of style? We're looking toward the lower school, that's one direction, or is it toward that direction? And if you fail to get this right, you would be thrown out of the class because you would be totally inept at identifying styles. But obviously, the middle school in 1955 is looking back to that lower school. So even though a fair amount of time has elapsed, modernism is still in the saddle, and that's the way to go. Whereas the Georgian building from 1924 is very much antiquated. So an interesting little point. I don't have a picture of the architect of the middle school building at Elliott Hall. Some of you may know the family, but this guy was very much instrumental in the next projects. This is Robert Parker Coffin, and he worked on 3 projects above all. One was the renovation or remodeling of the upper school, which has just occurred again, as Tom said. But here is the 1960-61 project. You can see they ripped the building apart, gutted it, and basically in a fairly short summer and maybe a little bit of the spring, they were able to create a new interior. So that's one project. It's now larger. It's lost its shutters, for what that's worth. Whether this was a stylistic thing or a cost thing, I don't know, but it's lost its shutters. It's a little bigger, and it's new on the interior. So that's project number 1, early 60s, 1960. This is the way it looked until fairly recently. And notice that little, keep this in mind, that little canopy at the entrance here on the north side. But okay, project number 2. You can see what's happening, I think. Knowsley is coming down. The old Garland estate is biting the dust, and this happened pretty rapidly, and this is 1959, 1960. Not a peep of protest today. People would be rioting. Preservationists would be just up in arms, and I would be among them. But at this time, nobody really cared that much. These buildings were considered old-fashioned and hard to maintain, which they were. And so, without much fanfare, down comes the grand old Knowsley. And here, these are from the pictures are from the Wilmette Life of that year. And I think the sign is still there. All that's sort of left to remind us of this building is the sign identifying the top of the parking lot or the whole driveway as Knowsley Circle. Okay, Project number 3, again, remember Robert Parker Coffin again, is the new gym, which I think was a real stroke of genius in a way. Maybe that puts a little too much, but to embed it sink it into that hill, rolling down to Church Street, because it was a large building and it would have dominated the campus had it been built on at the top of the hill. But here it is being built into the hillside. But on the other side, on the west side, it's rather low in profile, and it even makes a nod to the old auditorium building in that pedimented entranceway with the columns, which are still there, of course. These are squared off columns, and it's very simple. Nevertheless, it is a gesture to history, I think, and here is the history. And I thought, well, could we call this an early example of postmodernism? No, I don't. I think that's going too far. But nevertheless, that's kind of it's the same idea. The final project in this period is the 1965 Nathaniel French Art Center, and this is a building that it's the old gym, which you can see between the auditorium on the left and the older gym, the other gym on the right. And so the building was knocked down, and here's a picture of the demolition of that building, and a new building was simply dropped into the slot. And it's hard to see, really. It's not freestanding, but it too, it seems to me, makes a gesture to the past, which was not true with the middle school and the lower school buildings. There, the gesture are the little arches on those windows. Now, you may say, come on, but it's a simple building, admittedly, but nevertheless, it does attempt to, as I say, to make a nod to another period, which was not true with the other ones. Okay, this slide represents about 8 years of school history, that is the late 60s and the early 70s in particular, and this is a period when there wasn't any major building, probably thank God, because the energies were spent elsewhere. And I try to illustrate this with the golf team barbarians. If even the golf team can look like this, you know you've got trouble. And this in other words, is the wild 70s, the tumultuous 70s, which was really a nasty period in many ways, very difficult. Oops, getting to Dick in a second. George Eldridge became the head after Nat French left, probably glad to pass on the baton, and George did his best to keep a lid on things. Finally, sort of threw up his hands and decamped to the Royce-Moore School in Evanston, where he was the head of the upper school. And Doug McDonald came in as head for a few years. Again, no buildings. And in the late 70s, so we're covering about 10 years rather rapidly, Dick Hall becomes the head, and he would have that position for about 10 years. So again, we're talking about another 15 or so year, 20-year period elapsing, and it's time to think about a new building. And Dick and the faculty and administrators and the board all thought that the school really has an inadequate library. And if any of you remember the library at the top of the upper school, it really was a dreary place. This giant open space fringed with books in shelves, and not inspiring, not a good library at all. So the school needed a new library. And the question was where to put it and how to do it, and they hired the Chicago firm of Nagel and Hartray, very good firm, by the way, and Jack Hartray himself came over and looked around and came to the hall apparently and said, Dick, the last thing you need is a new building in this place. There's so many and so close together. I think we should kind of keep it out of sight, give it a low profile. So this is the first scheme for the new library, which would be dropped into the largest space at the center of the campus between the middle school and the old gym and the art center. And the interesting thing is the building indeed got built there, and it was that kind of low-slung situation. But look at the windows. This was rejected for whatever reason, stylistically or cost, I don't know. But that's not how it turned out, even though everything else about it is pretty close. Here is the. Oh yeah, this is a slide that Sierra found and that we both got a big kick out of. This is an odd cake. What's the deal here? Why this cake? This is marking the laying of the cornerstone and the groundbreaking, I should say. Why the cake in that shape? Because that's the shape of the building. So anyway, here is the way it turned out. Remember those windows? The horizontal band is replaced by those vertically placed. or I should say vertically oriented, rather traditional windows. And the plaza became known as the Elders Plaza. And notice the shrubs on top, so it's sort of a green roof effect, which was a new idea as well. And this becomes sort of the hub of the campus as well. This is another important thing. It's at the center roughly, it was open, it was connected to the middle and lower schools, easily accessible from the upper school, so it really became kind of a center. And it becomes known as the Hall Library for Richard Hall, the headmaster, but also it's important to mention the great contribution of Julian Parker Hall in creating this building. Oh, there's another view of the somewhat traditional windows. Julie Hall, okay. She becomes head in the early 90s after a very brief headmastership under Dean Lanphier, and she, building on the legacy of Dick Hall, it really reinvigorates the school and launches what I like to think, or helps launch what I like to think of as the late 20th century, early 21st century boom at the North Shore Country Day School in enrollment, in reputation, in financial matters, you name it. And now buildings weren't built during Julie's tenure, but there were some interesting projects, some small-scale projects that were done, which are important. These little things make a difference. The school had a pretty dreary sign before this new sign was put up. Also, this ratty old wall was replaced. The ratty old wall along Green Bay Road was replaced by this retaining wall and fence. And there's the fence, and new playgrounds. Now you might say, hey, wait, that's not new, and you're right. Sierra found these pictures of old playgrounds and it's a fascinating story, the history of playgrounds. So here you see a playground, I think roughly 1929, this is, the evolution of playgrounds at North Shore. And another one maybe 10 years later, and then finally we've gotten to this is the playground built during Julie's period, named for George Mitchell, who worked for so many years at the school, and this is the current playground. These playgrounds change fast, so this is the newest incarnation of the playground at the top of the circle. And let's see. So now we're in the early 21st century. We have a new headmaster whom you heard speak a few minutes ago, new at this time, and the middle of the decade is rolling around, and the school is ready to build again. It would be again. This is 20 years since the middle 80s, 2005. Everyone, or many people who've observed the school and thought about the school, realized that it had an inadequate science facilities, and so the priority was put there, and a new science center was built at the same time that the middle and lower schools were renovated. And Nagel and Hartray again were the architects, and once again they believed in keeping sort of a low profile, and so the building doesn't tower over everything else, and it sits on the frame, the structural frame that had been designed for the library, and was designed to carry more weight above it, and so it's sort of a vertically extendable building, not 50 stories, but still that's what it is in essence. So the building goes on top of the library. My favorite picture of it is on the other side, to show the glassiness of this building. This is new. This is modern sort of glass-walled architecture, and this has come back in popularity in the last 15 or 16 years. And I think this is a very handsome example of it. And you might say, isn't there a bit of a jarring contrast between the stucco and the red brick? And well, yes, it is. But so what? I think it works. I think it's handsome. And this is a grand analogy, but I feel a little bit the way about this that I feel about the Renzo piano glass addition to the Art Institute. It works. Okay, and now we're only 5 years later, and if you remembered my earlier comment, 15 and 20-year intervals were pretty common. So what's going on? Why so soon? Well, what's going on is success in enrollment, success in finances. There is money to be available for this, and so we have this most recent, or this very recent project, the redoing of the upper school, which is really very dramatic. And this is a view. This doesn't show the drama quite as vividly as the next slide, which I leapt ahead to. But the building was gutted. The roof is new. The windows are new. They repainted, of course, and the inside, new spaces were carved into the building. New furniture installed. New colors. New technology. New everything. It's really amazing. And the architect, Trong Lee, Vietnamese-born guy with Canon design, very much wanted to express the modernity, the newness on the exterior, and the school, to its credit, let him do it, and they didn't have to. I'm sure, wait till you see this next slide, if you haven't seen the building. Here it is. I mean, that's a pretty dramatic, if not shocking, contrast, although I love it. I think it's great. Inside, I only have one picture, but you get a little the idea of how they carved this V-shaped space into the building and the colors, and you've got to see it to really appreciate it, but it's very dramatic. And now, of course, as Tom said, the current project, which isn't quite done, but nearing completion, is the interior remodeling, remaking, really, of the auditorium and the Arts Center. Okay, the end. Thank you.